My name is Judith Hollander. I'm 72 years old. Once a mother, once a wife, always invisible. For 38 years, I kept the home that bore my husband's name, swept the floors, cooked the dinners, stitched the curtains by hand, paid attention so he didn't have to. I stopped working when Mason, our son, was born. Harold said, "You're the backbone now." I'll be the face I believed him. I believed a lot of things back then. But this morning, I sat at the end of a glass-paneled conference room in a downtown law office while my son, the same boy I once taught to tie his shoes, leaned forward in a tailored gray suit and said clearly, loudly, "Don't count on a cent from Dad's $142 million trust. She's old, useless, and legally nothing." No one flinched. No one hushed him. They all laughed. Even Clarice, his wife, who had once cried at our wedding anniversary toast. Even Emily, my granddaughter, who used to braid my hair and called me Sunshine. They chuckled as if I weren't sitting right there, wrapped in the same black shawl I wore at Harold's funeral 48 hours ago, hands folded over my lap, holding one final document, thin, warm from my palm, and heavy with everything they never thought to ask. I didn't speak. I didn't rise. I just looked at Mason, his polished watch, his perfect cufflinks, the little smirk on his face when he thought the room was his. He didn't know the name on the document I held would be mine. And when Mr. Alden, Harold's attorney, finally opened the briefcase and pressed play on the recorder, my husband's voice filled the room, not as a ghost, but as a reckoning. His tone was calm, slower than I remembered, more tired but still measured. He began, "If my son ever speaks ill of his mother, deduct 1 million per word." The silence that followed was the loudest I've ever heard. Mason blinked, then sat up straighter. "What the hell does that mean?" he asked, already sweating. Mr. Alden didn't answer. He simply pulled out a transcript. Black ink, paragraphs numbered. "Verified via home security audio," he explained, then began to read. "She's still breathing? Thought she'd be gone by now. She's old, useless, and legally nothing. Don't count on a cent." 88 documented lines, 88 million gone. Mason dropped his espresso. It shattered across the leather flooring. No one laughed this time. And I, still sitting in silence, looked at my name printed on the last page. Full name, no longer hidden beneath Harold's. And in that moment, I knew. They thought I was dead, but I was still thinking. And this time, they would have to listen. If you've ever felt dismissed in your own family, if you've ever been written out of your own story, you're not alone. Stay with me. This isn't just about inheritance. It's about memory, justice, and the quiet power of being underestimated. Let me take you back, before the will, before the suit jackets and whispered insults, to the house where it all began. 48 hours after we buried my husband, they started tagging my life with stickers. Neon ones, pink, orange, lime green, each slapped onto furniture, dishes, paintings, memories, like price tags in a clearance aisle. "This one's mine," said Caleb, my grandson, as he pressed a fluorescent pink label onto the grandfather clock. It still chimed off-key every hour, something Harold had always meant to fix, but never did. The sticker covered the small brass plate that read, Hollander, 1981. Then came the leather reading chair, the crystal bowl on the coffee table, the antique record player we danced to during power outages. "This one, too," he grinned, turning to his sister. "Let's just claim everything before the cousins arrive." Emily didn't answer. She was too busy holding up her phone, walking in slow circles with some kind of app that showed blueprints and furniture measurements. "We can knock out this wall," she said. "Turn the den into a tasting room. Maybe a spa. Add skylights." I stood at the edge of the staircase, one hand still gripping the banister Harold once sanded down himself. No one looked up. No one saw me standing there. My black dress still smelled faintly of lilies and earth. My eyes were dry. My body was present. But in their minds, I was already gone. Clarice, my daughter-in-law, waltzed past me with a tray of champagne flutes. "Toast to Dad's legacy," she sang out. "He built something real." Now we carry it forward. Someone, maybe Caleb, muttered, "And sweep out the ghosts while we're at it." They laughed, loudly. My chair at the dining table was missing, replaced with a folding one brought up from the garage. It wobbled. No cushion, no back support. "There's more room in the mudroom," Clarice said with a smile, "away from the noise." "You'll be more comfortable there," I nodded, because nodding was easier than explaining why I felt like an exhibit being relocated. I walked past the table I'd set for every holiday, past the piano Harold never learned to play, past the wall where our wedding photo used to hang before someone replaced it with a generic canvas print of lavender fields. In the mudroom, a paper plate of cold chicken waited on top of a plastic stool. A half-empty bottle of water sat beside it. No napkin, no silverware, just silence. I sat across from a broken broom and a rust-stained mop bucket. The floor was sticky. The window overlooked the driveway where the rose bushes Harold planted were starting to brown. No one had watered them since the burial. In the other room, the laughter grew louder. "This house smells like mothballs and regret," someone said. "Let's gut the kitchen." That tile is tragic. Another neon sticker appeared, this one slapped onto the cherrywood sideboard beside me. "This one's mine," Caleb said, again. "Perfect for the lake house." Emily entered, still scanning the room through her phone. "Once she's out, we should raise the ceilings. Maybe glass doors to the backyard, let in more light." She turned slowly in place, stepping inches from my foot without acknowledging me. "She built soup," someone scoffed from the other side of the wall. "He built an empire. Can we forward her pension checks if she moves out?" Another joked. "God, she's practically compost." The words floated through the air like ash. No one paused. No one blinked. I held my tea with both hands so it wouldn't rattle. They didn't whisper. They weren't hiding it. They simply didn't care if I heard, because to them, I didn't count. And maybe I never did, but I still had breath, and I still had a folder. Tucked in the pocket of my cardigan was a bank memorandum, dated 18 years ago, signed and notarized. My name, Judith M. Hollander, typed in bold. The document outlined my personal capital injection into Hollander and Company, made during its financial collapse. A private contribution, a rescue that never made the papers, because I never asked for it to. Back then, when Harold came home, pale, defeated, and silent, I didn't cry. I didn't panic. I just opened the velvet box of heirloom jewelry, my grandmother's brooch, my mother's emerald necklace, my wedding bangles, and sold every piece. Then I wired the funds and told Harold, "Use it. But don't ever tell them it came from me." And he didn't, until now. In the other room, Mason's voice pierced through, "We'll keep the Lexus. Dad said it was mine, and the Montana property, already in our name." "I want the Hermes scarves," said Emily, "even if they're hers." "She's not using them." I took a bite of the cold chicken. It tasted like chalk, but I swallowed it anyway. Because while they divided what they thought was left of me, I knew the truth sat quietly in my pocket. A single document, crisp, real, and legally binding. They had stickered their names on every object that ever held meaning, but they never thought to ask about the meaning behind them. They assumed the story ended when Harold did, but the story had a second author, and she was still breathing. The room they gave me wasn't a room at all. It was the laundry area at the back of the house, once just a pass-through between the kitchen and the garage, now apparently deemed suitable for the woman who used to own it. There was a bare cot pushed up against the wall, draped in an old moving blanket. No sheet, no pillow. A plastic folding chair sat beside it, its leg wrapped in masking tape to keep it level. A flickering bulb swung above me like a tired eye. The air smelled of bleach, old water, and something faintly metallic. Rust, maybe. There were no curtains, no welcome. Just a thermos with a dent in its side, a chipped mug, and a box of tissues half used. Someone had tried to make it. Looked like a space meant for rest, but it felt more like something temporary, a stopgap, a soft dismissal. On the counter near the mop bucket, I noticed a photo frame. Face down, the glass cracked in one corner. I picked it up, wiped the dust off with the sleeve of my cardigan. It was our wedding anniversary photo. The 35th, I think. We stood under the rose arbor in the backyard, Harold's arm wrapped around my waist, my hand resting lightly on his chest. Behind us, the house gleamed in early spring light. Freshly painted shutters, yellow tulips poking through the mulch, pride blooming in every corner. But now, this photo had been shoved behind the fridge, hidden between a broom and a box of expired granola bars. And across the glass, stuck like a slap, was a neon sticker. Outdated. The word landed like a bruise. I stared at it for a long time. Not the picture, just the word. Outdated. Not broken, not fragile, just obsolete. Something once necessary. Now inconvenient. They hadn't even bothered to throw it away, just tucked it where no one would see it, where I wouldn't see it. But I did. I carried the frame back to the cot and set it gently on the chair. That night, lying beneath the scratchy blanket, I stared at the ceiling as the bulb hummed and blinked above me. A quiet, unspoken rhythm, like Morse code from a time when people still wrote letters. And I remembered, that night. The one they'll never know about. Harold had come home late, worn thin by meetings and market charts and men in suits who didn't see him as a leader anymore. The company was gasping. Investors were pulling out. The board had rejected every version of the IPO pitch he drafted. He looked at me that night, not for solutions, but for a place to collapse. And I let him. When he went to bed, I stayed up. I made a pot of chamomile tea, tied my hair back, and sat at the kitchen table with nothing but a legal pad and a borrowed pen. No computer, no printer, just my hands and my mind. I outlined an expansion model, multi-phase, responsive to market trends, scalable across regions. I wrote until dawn. By the end, my knuckles ached, and my tea had gone cold. At the top of the page, where a name should go, I didn't write mine. Instead, I wrote J. Carver, a name I made up in that moment. Short, sharp, unmistakably male, because I knew. I knew if Harold handed the board a strategy authored by his wife, once a finance analyst, now a homemaker, they would see a wife, not a mind. So I sealed the pages in an envelope and mailed them to the office. No return address, no handwriting clue. 2 days later, at dinner, he laughed as he told me someone had sent an anonymous proposal that was, in his words, brilliant. Even the penmanship, he said, reminded him of mine. I smiled and kept stirring the soup. That proposal became the backbone of their IPO launch. It brought in $47 million. And no one ever knew. Not the board. Not the employees. Not my son. They called Harold a visionary. They called me lucky. But I remember, even if no one else does. I remember the smudge of ink near the margin where my hand slipped, the little note I scribbled in the corner, add alternate cost projection, see spreadsheet from '98. I remember how I wrote risk curve and then crossed it out and replaced it with stabilization model. I remember the night I let my name go, because Harold needed a win, and I loved him. But love, I've learned, can sometimes ask for too much silence. I turned toward the wall, the photo frame now sitting beside me. Outdated, the sticker said. I peeled it off slowly, like you'd remove a bandage from skin that still hurts. Then I folded it once and slid it into the trash. I wasn't outdated. I was unpublished. And I was done hiding footnotes inside someone else's headlines. The clinking of glasses echoed like soft jabs in the chandelier light. Silverware met porcelain in polite, practiced rhythms. Laughter floated above the table like steam, except the steam was missing from my bowl. I sat at the far end where the light didn't quite reach, beside the sideboard they hadn't used in years. A draft kissed the back of my neck. My soup had gone cold a long time ago. No one noticed. They were too busy complimenting the dry-aged roast Caleb ordered online and the curated cheese board Emily had photographed for her story, each square of brie arranged with surgical precision. I stirred the broth absently, watching carrots bob and dip like forgotten promises. Clarice's voice rang out, saccharine and sharp. "We were just saying, Mom, it's amazing how far this family's come." From soup to private jets, her fork pierced a cherry tomato with just a bit too much force. Caleb chuckled. "Yeah, seriously. Back in the day, it was just soup, soup, and more soup. And coupons," Emily chimed in. "Remember the coupon drawer?" More laughter. Clarice leaned back, took a sip of her wine, and added with a smile just tight enough to cut, "But hey, if there's one thing she nailed, it's soup. Right, Mom?" They all turned toward me then, performative grins stretched across their curated lives. I smiled back softly, the kind of smile that doesn't climb past the cheeks, the kind of smile that holds its breath. I didn't say a word, because I remembered. Soup had built this house. Soup paid for the hardwood floors beneath their designer heels. Soup paid for the college degrees they now used as shields against humility. Soup funded Harold's seed capital in the first place. It started with a borrowed crock-pot and a handful of onions from the neighbor's garden. I cooked and sold $5 jars of lentil and barley stew out of our garage to office workers too busy to pack lunch. Harold laughed at first, said no one would pay for hippie broth, until the orders came in, until we had to hire someone to help with deliveries, until we launched an LLC, until that LLC gave him the business credit he needed to pursue real estate investments, and then tech. But now it was just a punchline. I looked down at my spoon. The broth had formed a skin. I ate in silence. After dessert, a pear tart Clarice claimed she baked but clearly hadn't, I stood to gather my things. No one offered help. The plates they left behind still held streaks of gravy and lipstick. In the laundry room, I spread everything I had onto the cot like relics from a forgotten war. The photo frame, the one they called outdated. I polished the glass with the hem of my sweater until our smiles shone again. Next, a letter from Harold, one I'd kept hidden for years, folded 3 times, soft at the creases, dated the night after the board approved the IPO. "I know what you did, Jude," it read. "You saved me." Again. And they'll never know. But I do. Every line of that plan smelled like chamomile and candle wax and the way you hold a pen when you're thinking. I don't deserve you. It was unsigned, but I knew his handwriting like I knew my own bones. And then, the last piece, a manila folder, frayed at the edges. Inside, my original draft, handwritten, annotated. J. Carver scrawled across the top in black ink. The paper had yellowed slightly, but the ideas still burned. I traced the underlines I'd made in red, notes in the margin. Recalibrate fiscal curve Q2 to Q4, benchmark against B2B phase. Include projections for low cap uptake. I had forgotten nothing. In the corner of the page, a doodle, a soup ladle, drawn in the half-sleep of early morning. Even my margins remembered who I was. They had tried to reduce me to a recipe, a quiet woman with a good heart and nothing more. But hearts remember, and mine had been quietly taking notes all along. That night I couldn't sleep, not because of the cold, not because of the ache in my back from the cot or the bulb that never stopped buzzing, but because something in me had begun to stir. Not anger, not bitterness, something older. Something precise. Like the way my mother used to say, "Don't throw out what you might still need, Judith." I hadn't. And now, maybe, just maybe, I'd finally need it. The dial tone in my room had been dead for 3 days. They claimed it was the storm. Caleb shrugged and said, "You know how these old houses are?" Clarice nodded. "We'll get around to fixing it eventually." But the Wi-Fi worked just fine for them, and so did the espresso machine. I said nothing. That evening, after dinner, cold fish and colder conversation, I slipped into my coat and stepped outside. The air held the bite of late fall, sharp and clean, like something that hadn't been touched by lies. The old phone booth still stood near the gas station, cloaked in rust and the scent of diesel. Its plexiglass walls were etched with names and warnings, layered in years of permanent marker. I closed the door behind me. The click echoed louder than I expected. Inside my pocket was a crumpled $20 bill I had tucked away months ago, back when Harold's cough began to sound more like punctuation than an accident. I fed coins into the slot, 1 ring, 2, 3, then a voice I hadn't heard in years, deep, worn, familiar. Alden and Hayes. "It's Judith Hollander," I said quietly. "I need you to come tomorrow. Early. Bring everything." There was a beat of silence. "Judith?" His voice dropped. Are you sure?" "No, but I'm done being unsure. Meet me at the old cabin, 8 a.m. I hung up before he could ask why. Back in the laundry room, I laid everything out on the cot once more. My fingers moved slower tonight, not from age, from weight. The manila folder, the letter, the photos. And beneath them all, tucked into the lining of an old briefcase Harold once gave me, a thin black notebook, its spine cracked gently as I opened it. Inside, records, years of them, meeting notes, projections, margins, edits. It was the ghost of the company in my handwriting. Harold once called it the soul of the plan. I remembered the night he first said it. He'd just returned from a board meeting that nearly fell apart over their fiscal roadmap. He sat down at the foot of our bed, his tie undone, his voice a whisper. "I don't know what to do, Jude." I had handed him a fresh cup of tea and the revised version of the deck, one I had rewritten entirely the night before. He read it twice, then said, "You just saved everything." I smiled. "You always knew that everything was built on soup and spreadsheets." We laughed then. The kind of laugh people have when they still believe in each other. But that was before the IPO, before the fame, before the silence grew roots. I flipped to the final page of the notebook. A list. My list. Not of enemies, of truth. Each line a piece of the puzzle I had once assembled with love, now gathered with precision. I wasn't angry. Not anymore. Anger had burned through me years ago and left something cleaner behind, like rain after wildfire. What I felt now was different. Clarity. Purpose. Like a key long buried, finally matching the lock. I stood by the window for a long time that night, watching the streetlight flicker. The others were asleep, or at least pretending to be. The silence in the house wasn't peaceful. It was hollow, like a room after a party, crumbs where laughter once lived. And I realized something. I had not simply been erased. I had erased myself, quietly, willingly, for Harold, for the children, for the dream of unity. I thought silence was protection, that by fading into the background, I was shielding them from tension, from fragility, from knowing too much. But silence doesn't protect. It permits. And after enough years, it doesn't just make you invisible. It convinces them you were never there to begin with. In the reflection of the glass, I saw myself. Not the grandmother they ushered past, not the woman who made soup, not the ghost in the laundry room, but Judith Carver Hollander, founder in every way but name, witness to a lie dressed as legacy, and tomorrow I would speak, not with rage, not to shame, but to remember, because remembering is its own kind of justice, and I owed that to myself. The office hadn't changed. Same oak paneling, same dust-sweet smell of legal tomes lined up like silent soldiers. Time clung to the curtains in here, stiff, still. Alden looked up from his desk the moment I walked in. He was older now. The corners of his eyes held more weight, but the way he stood, that swift push from the armrests and immediate straightening of the shoulders, reminded me of the man who once helped Harold and me sign our first joint property contract, Judith. He crossed the room and pulled out a chair for me, voice softer than I'd expected. "You look composed." I sat without answering. Composed was a generous word for what I was, but I appreciated the effort. I opened my bag. From its folds, I laid them out one by one, like a prayer in 3 parts. First, the contract. Original signatures, dates, equity lines. Back when we were nothing but debt and dreams. Second, Harold's letter. Handwritten. Folded so many times the crease was nearly splitting. His confession, not of guilt, but of recognition. Acknowledgement that my ideas had saved his company before it had a name. And third, the handwritten IPO proposal, dated 2 weeks before Harold's stroke. The final one, the clean version. No edits. My penmanship, my vision. Signed, J. Carver. Alden adjusted his glasses, then leaned in. He didn't speak for nearly a minute. His fingers traced the edge of the paper, as if by touch he could confirm what his eyes refused to believe. Then he looked at me. "You're J. Carver." His voice wasn't shocked. It was reverent, as though saying it aloud made the room smaller, more intimate. I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I nodded. Just once. Slow, deliberate. The weight of years balanced in that movement. And then I looked at him, straight through the veneer of age and comfort and memory. Tears pressed at the edge of my lashes, but I held them back. Not out of pride, out of intention. There was dignity in being seen, fully and without disguise, for the first time in decades. "Yes," I said finally, "I was the ghostwriter, the strategist, the one who wasn't in the pictures." Alden exhaled, like someone realizing they had been holding their breath for years. "But why?" I smiled. It wasn't a bitter smile, just one with lines. "Because Harold asked me to. He said, 'Let me be the face. Let you be the fire.' He had promised it would just be for a season, that once things were stable, we'd step forward together. But then the seasons changed, and we didn't. Success has a way of making men forget promises made in small kitchens." Alden sat back down. He reread the letter, then the contract, then the IPO draft. "This changes everything," he whispered. "Does it?" He looked at me, puzzled. "I don't want to erase his name," I said. "Only reclaim mine." He nodded slowly. "You were always there, weren't you?" he murmured. "Yes," I answered. "In the margins, in the spreadsheets, in the pauses between meetings. I was always there." I folded my hands in my lap. "Now it's time they remember that." He took out a legal pad, scribbled dates, cross-referenced timelines. I watched him move from disbelief to strategy in less than 10 minutes. Some men still believed in justice. Some men still respected origin stories. And Alden, to his credit, never once asked why I stayed silent so long. He understood that sometimes silence isn't weakness, it's endurance. Before I left, he gently slid the documents back into their envelope, carefully as one might tuck in a child. "We'll amend the estate," he said. "We'll reinstate the original holdings, equity, authorship, all of it. Harold may be gone, but his last amendment was dated and witnessed. It'll hold." I nodded. "There will be backlash," he added softer. "They won't understand." I met his eyes. They never asked to. As I stepped back into the cold morning, I didn't feel taller or stronger. I just felt returned. To myself, to my voice, to the name I once buried beneath love and loyalty. J. Carver, Judith Hollander, one and the same, no longer a whisper behind the curtain. The days blurred into one another after the meeting with Alden. I spent most of them in silence, occupying the edges of a house that had once been mine, but now treated me like a polite inconvenience. The only thing that belonged to me anymore was time, and I used it wisely. By the fourth day, Alden called. "It's ready," he said. "Come by tomorrow. There's something I want you to see with your own eyes." I arrived at his office just after 10 a.m. The air smelled faintly of cedar polish and winter sunlight. Something soft, something old. His assistant offered me tea. I declined. Alden waved me in. He didn't speak at first, just gestured toward the thick beige folder resting on his desk. I sat. He opened it, turning the first few pages as if unveiling a sacred text. Each sheet was labeled, dated, stamped, all meticulous, all clinical. "Handwriting analysis," he said, tapping the header. I had to be sure. Legally. Professionally, I didn't take offense. I understood the stakes. He continued, voice calm but sure. "We brought in Dr. Porter. Retired FBI forensic specialist. She's the best." I watched his fingers move down the page until they landed on a line of comparison images, side by side, overlapping signatures, looping J's and firm R's, my writing, on grocery lists, on birthday cards, on sticky notes Harold used to leave on his mirror with my edits, scribbled in the margins. And beside it, J. Carver, on the IPO draft, the expansion proposals, the revised revenue models, different contexts, same stroke, same woman, same mind. Then came the final page, bold black ink across the bottom. Match. 100% certainty. Underneath, Dr. Porter's formal signature and her forensic seal. Alden slid the folder toward me. "We can certify authorship. We can confirm contribution. You're no longer invisible, Judith." My hand trembled as I reached for the page, and when I touched the seal, I nearly lost my breath. Not because of power, not even because of justice, but because, for the first time in years, on paper, in law, in ink, someone saw me. Not as an accessory, not as a behind-the-scenes wife, not as a relic with soup stains and forgotten recipes, but as the architect, the origin, the reason a trust fund existed in the first place. My thumb pressed against the embossed circle as if trying to memorize its texture. For so long, my legacy had been whispers. This was proof, cold, unbiased, undeniable. I blinked hard, swallowing the lump that had lodged itself behind my ribs. Alden handed me a glass of water. I hadn't noticed my hands shaking until the glass touched my palm. "I thought I'd feel angry," I said, my voice barely louder than a breath. "But it's not that." "What is it?" he asked gently. I looked at him. "It's the ache of being seen too late, and still being grateful." He didn't respond with platitudes. That was something I appreciated about Alden. He had practiced law long enough to know that recognition, real recognition, rarely arrives on time. But when it does, it still matters. I tucked the folder into my bag, smoothing the corners like they were precious. "Will it hold?" I asked him. "Legally?" "Yes. Emotionally?" He paused. "I don't know." "That's up to them," I gave a quiet laugh. "They're not wired to see women like me, especially not when we've been so good at erasing ourselves." He met my eyes. "But you're not erased anymore." Number. Not anymore. I left the office and stood for a while outside on the steps, letting the winter air wrap itself around me like a shawl. My fingers still tingled from the paper, from the seal, from the truth I no longer had to keep folded in a drawer. The sun cracked through the clouds, and I let it. Back at the house, no one noticed I'd been gone. Clarice was on the phone in the sunroom, laughing into a martini. Emily was unpacking lavender-scented towels for her soon-to-be wellness suite. Mason was barking at someone on Bluetooth, pacing in the study Harold once called his thinking room. And me, I stood at the base of the staircase, folder in hand, truth in pocket, history in spine. They didn't look up, didn't ask where I'd gone, didn't wonder what I'd done. but they would, soon. I keep the box. Still, even now. It's hidden beneath the last drawer of the old dresser, inside a pocket of fabric where moths don't bother going. The velvet has faded to a tired gray, and the hinges creak when you open it. But I open it anyway, sometimes. The inside is empty, but the echo remains. That's where the family rubies used to lie, deep garnet red, set in soft gold. My grandmother wore them to her wedding. My mother wore them to the opening of the symphony hall, and I wore them once. Just once. Then winter came. It was the kind of winter that makes wood groan in the walls and turns the tips of your fingers blue, even inside. Harold paced the living room, talking into 2 phones at once, rubbing the back of his neck like he could massage away the numbers, red, glaring, insistent, that flooded his ledgers. I remember the exact night. Snow slammed against the windows like someone was trying to claw their way in. The fireplace had burned out hours ago, and neither of us noticed. He didn't sleep, barely ate. I had to remind him to breathe between meetings. "We're weeks away," he told me one night. "From what?" I asked. "Oblivion," he said. "I can't make payroll next month." Harold was not a man who cried, but that night when he thought I was asleep, I heard him, in the kitchen. Silent tears into a coffee mug that had long gone cold. I didn't go to him. I went upstairs instead, to the dresser, to the box. The pawnbroker didn't ask many questions, just appraised the stones with surgical speed and gave me a number on a yellow sticky note. I didn't haggle. I didn't blink. I transferred the funds directly into the business account under my name, quietly, without ceremony. The next day, payroll cleared. 2 weeks later, Harold landed a last-minute contract that saved the company. He came home with champagne and tulips, kissed me like we were 25 again, and whispered, "We made it, Judith." He never asked how. He never wondered why the jewelry case was locked and left untouched. And I never offered the truth. Because sometimes, love is swallowing the weight of what someone else never saw, and carrying it anyway. Years later, when the company celebrated its IPO, I watched him toast in a crisp tuxedo. The newspaper headline read, "Hollander Rescues Empire from Brink." Everyone clapped. Even I smiled. But I remember looking at my hand that night, bare, just skin and veins and the memory of something precious that had once curled around my fingers. I kept the receipt, the transaction record, tucked between the birth certificates and expired passports, a paper trail no one cared to follow, until now. I open the box again as I sit alone in the laundry room, my current residence in this grand house. The whir of a distant vacuum hums like a lullaby. I touch the velvet, run my fingers over the indentations left by the stones. My thumb presses the corner where the clasp used to catch. It doesn't hurt. Not anymore, but it stings. Like the phantom burn of something. Too heavy for too long. I once heard someone say that sacrifice only means something if someone remembers it. But I disagree. Sometimes the act of giving freely, quietly, completely carries its own holiness, even if no one applauds. Even if it's buried in a drawer for decades. Even if the ones you saved forget your name. I close the box. Tuck it back into its fabric pocket, and this time, I don't feel empty when I walk away, because maybe, just maybe, being forgotten doesn't mean you didn't matter. Maybe it just means you were the kind of woman who built cathedrals no one thought to name, but they still stand. The house was asleep. Harold had gone upstairs hours earlier, defeated. I could hear the slow creak of floorboards as he walked the hallway outside our room, then nothing. No more pacing, just the stillness of a man with no plans left to make. Downstairs, the only light came from the desk lamp, a halo over blank paper. The television flickered silently in the other room. Static shadows danced on the wallpaper. The smell of burnt toast still hung faintly in the air. He hadn't eaten it. He never did when stress took over. The fire had long since died in the hearth, just gray bones of ash. I remember sitting in that chair like I was preparing for battle, blue pen in hand, cold coffee beside me, 3 drafts of failed proposals scattered across the floor like fallen soldiers. Harold had tried. Lord, he had tried. But what he couldn't do was think clearly with panic lodged in his chest. And I knew if we submitted another weak pitch, the board would vote to dissolve everything. I stared at the blank page. Then I wrote. Not quickly, not poetically. I didn't channel some divine inspiration. I channeled numbers, strategy, gut instinct. 20 years of watching patterns in silence, boardrooms I wasn't allowed to enter, meetings where I poured the coffee but heard everything. I knew how the firm moved, how it breathed. I knew what it needed to survive, and I knew how to write it in their language. I drafted the proposal line by line, laid out the asset restructuring plan, diversification approach, new venture projections. I did it all while the pen bled blue ink onto my thumb. Around 2:17 a.m., I knocked over the coffee. The mug shattered. A jagged crescent flew across the kitchen tile, and the page, 2/3 complete, was soaked down the side. The ink bled like bruises. I didn't cry. I just started again. From scratch, on clean paper, with shaking hands, and that same stupid pen. By 5:46 a.m., the sun was a sliver on the horizon. Orange light broke through the lace curtain above the sink. I signed it. J. Carver. It was the only name they'd recognize. The name we'd used before when I ghost wrote early filings, back when Harold still trusted my anonymity more than my visibility. We told ourselves it was just a placeholder, that once the company stood on its own, I'd come forward. But time has a way of turning placeholders into prisons. I sealed the proposal in a manila envelope, dropped it in the blue mailbox 2 blocks from the house. It felt strange, sending away the future before my husband even woke up. When I got home, Harold was still asleep, one leg half off the bed, his arm over his eyes, like a boy trying to hide from the dawn. I crawled into bed beside him. He never asked where I'd been. 2 weeks later, they called. The board. They loved it, said it was bold, clean, efficient. One executive even called it the work of a quiet genius. Harold smiled wide and bashful and told them he'd had a breakthrough. They shook his hand, clapped him on the back, toasted with champagne at a small lunch downtown. He came home flushed, excited. His jacket smelled like garlic and wine. He kissed me, twirled me in the hallway like we were 30 again, and whispered, "You saved us." I nodded, smiled, but he didn't say my name. That night, he stood in the dining room, holding the letter from the board in one hand and a scotch in the other. "They're calling me the comeback king," he said, voice thick with pride. And I stood by the doorway wearing the same cardigan I wore when I mailed the envelope. "I told them I stayed up all night with that one," he chuckled, said it just came to me. I didn't respond, just watched the scotch swirl in his glass like it held the truth I wasn't allowed to tell. A part of me died that night, not in anger, not in bitterness, but in quiet resignation. The woman who had once dreamed of co-leading an empire folded herself into the margins instead, not because I was weak, but because I thought that was what love looked like, letting him shine, letting him speak, letting the world applaud him while I stood behind the curtain, steadying the stage. He wasn't cruel. He was just grateful in the wrong direction, and I was too proud to correct him, so I let him keep the story, let him carry the glory, let him stand on the foundation I built with ink-stained fingers and cold coffee. Now, all these years later, I watch the ink again, that same blue signature, J. Carver, confirmed by analysts, legally matched, validated, not whispered, not hidden, seen. They called him a genius. But it was my mind that wrote the future, and now I'm taking it back. I didn't storm out of the house. I didn't shout. I didn't slam doors or toss plates. That's not how women like me fight. We don't raise our voices. We raise documents. We raise truths that were left to rot in silence. I spent the morning sorting through the old banker's box I kept behind the linen closet, the one no one ever thought to check because they assumed I had nothing to store. I laid everything across the bed in the guest room, the room Clarice now called her yoga retreat, though I'd only seen her meditate long enough to photograph it. Contracts, handwritten ledgers, the original draft of the IPO still, faintly stained with coffee from that night. I organized them like a story, because that's what it was, a story buried under a man's name. I took photos of every page, ensuring dates and signatures were clear. I pressed them flat with trembling fingers. Each snap of the camera flashed like a tiny exhale, one image after another, silent, sharp, precise. I was documenting my existence, my mind, my labor, my invisible architecture. I tucked the physical copies into a leather portfolio, a gift from Harold, ironically embossed with his initials. Then I slipped the flash drive into my coat pocket, zipped it up, and left without anyone noticing. Emily was in the living room trying to feng shui her energy flow. Caleb was arguing with the plumber. Clarice was booking spa tiles online. Mason hadn't come downstairs. They didn't even ask where I was going. They assumed I had nowhere to be. Alden's office smelled like cedar and thyme. He opened the door himself. No assistant this time. I placed the folder and the flash drive on his desk like an offering, but there was no desperation in the gesture, only steadiness, a sense that something long overdue had found its shape. He sat down slowly, fingers tracing the edge of the folder. "You were J. Carver," he murmured again, not as a question this time, just reverence. I nodded. His eyes narrowed, focused. Then he flipped open the cover. Silence stretched as he reviewed the documents. He moved like a man trained to parse fraud, but there was none here. Only facts they never thought to trace back to me. Papers that bore my hand, margins with my notes, memos written in a tone Harold never quite mastered. Alden leaned back, exhaled through his nose. "Well," he said, resting a palm on the papers, "they won't be able to deny this." I looked at him and said nothing, just watched his fingers press down on a truth I'd once given away. He pulled out a notepad and began scribbling notes, action steps, witnesses, potential media leverage if needed. He talked strategy. I watched, not because I didn't understand, but because I did, deeply. I knew this was where the tides began to turn, not in courts or headlines, but in quiet offices with old wood and older women. When he finished, he looked at me with a new kind of gaze. Not pity, not formality, but recognition. "This isn't revenge," he said, not even waiting for my answer. "No," I whispered. "This is reclamation." I stood to leave, gathering the empty folder in my hand. At the door, I paused. "They'll be angry," I said. "They'll call me bitter." He nodded. "Then let them taste bitterness," he replied. "It's usually the medicine they prescribe to others." Outside, the wind pulled at the lapels of my coat. I clutched the zipper where the flash drive still sat, its weight tiny but undeniable. I walked past the bakery that used to carry my favorite rye, past the florist that still arranged white lilies the way Harold liked them, past the bench where we once talked about naming our first child after my grandmother. Everything had changed, and yet it hadn't. The streets were still paved with the assumption that people like me vanished when we grew quiet, but I never vanished. I just stopped being visible to those who no longer found me useful. As I crossed the street toward the bus stop, I whispered to myself, not in anger, but in declaration, "I'm not trying to ruin their world. I'm just trying to return to mine." They called it Harold's legacy, but half of it was mine, not because I demanded it, but because I built it. And now I would no longer ask to be seen. I would make it legally impossible to ignore me. Not with fists, not with threats, with names, with dates, with receipts, with truth. I didn't want revenge. I wanted my name returned to the story they stole. And this time, it would be carved in more than silence. They held the reading in the glass conference room on the 33rd floor, cold, echoing. Every sound bounced off the windows as if even the city itself wanted to listen. They made sure to give me the folding chair, the one at the very end of the polished walnut table, next to the water station, far from the center where the real decisions would be announced. I didn't mind. There's something powerful about sitting where they don't expect you to speak. Mason was the last to arrive, of course. Loud, overdressed, carrying a Starbucks cup he didn't pay for. He greeted the room like he was hosting a gala. Everyone laughed. Emily beamed. Clarice rolled her eyes like she found his charm exhausting, but endearing. He made his way to the head of the table and clapped Alden on the shoulder, as if that old man hadn't spent the last 2 months deciphering a truth Mason never saw coming. Mason gave me a look, one that scanned quickly and dismissed me faster. "Still kicking, huh?" he muttered, voice just loud enough for Clarice and Emily to hear. "Figured you'd croak before Christmas." Clarice snorted. Emily whispered something about me probably hoarding funeral coupons in my knitting drawer. I didn't blink. I didn't flinch. I sat with my hands folded in my lap, left hand on top, right hand tucked underneath, clutching a single envelope wrapped in plastic, protection from rain, fingerprints, and the greasy illusion of power. Alden cleared his throat. He didn't ask for quiet. He didn't need to. The room recognized the gravity in his posture, the way his fingers didn't fidget, the way he adjusted his glasses with slow, precise intent. He placed a small device on the table, one of those old-school voice recorders, tapped it once, red light on. The room hushed. "I'll begin with the standard procedural language," he said, voice low but firm, "then I'll play Mr." Harold Hollander's recorded message. Mason leaned back like he'd heard it all before. "You all know the drill," he said. "Dad gave me power of attorney 2 years before his stroke. Everything is already under my administration. This is more of a, what's the word, formality." He turned to the room, grinning. "And don't count on a cent from Dad's $142 million trust," he added. "Especially not the old lady over there. She's, what's the legal term?" He chuckled. "Oh, right, nothing." They laughed, not all of them, but enough to echo. I kept still. Let them believe I was shrinking, that I'd already surrendered. Let them look past the hand on the envelope, the calm breath, the narrowed eyes. Alden didn't look at me, but he reached for the envelope I had passed him moments earlier. He slid it silently into his folder, a subtle gesture between two people who understood the weight of restraint. Then he clicked play. Harold's voice filled the room, worn, gravelly, still sharp. There was a pause before he began, just enough to unsettle Mason's shoulders. "This is Harold Bennett Hollander," the voice said. "If you're hearing this, I'm gone." Mason rolled his eyes. Emily dabbed at invisible tears. "But before we divide what I've built," Harold continued, "you should know who helped build it." There was a shift, subtle, like the sound of air being pulled into a vacuum. Harold's tone deepened. "I've amended my will," he said, "because I remember who sold her heirloom earrings to cover payroll, who stayed up drafting the documents that saved us, who signed as J. Carver when the banks wouldn't trust my name alone." Mason stopped tapping his pen. "My wife, Judith Hollander," Harold said clearly, "owns 51% of the Hollander Trust." Silence. Dead silence. I felt the moment Mason's world cracked. He didn't speak. Not yet. He couldn't. His espresso cup trembled in his hand. A drop landed on his sleeve. He looked at it like it betrayed him. Alden placed a printed document in front of him, signed, sealed, stamped. He read aloud. By this amendment, I transfer controlling interest of the Hollander Family Trust, currently valued at $142 million, to Judith Elaine Hollander in recognition of her uncredited labor and intellectual property under the pseudonym J. Carver, my name. It echoed louder than Mason's laughter ever had. Clarice choked on her sparkling water. Emily's lip quivered. Mason collapsed into his chair. His voice, usually brash and smug, came out thin. Wait! That's not legal. But even he knew better. Alden had the receipts. I had the name. Harold had finally told the truth. And I hadn't said a word. Not yet. But I looked at each of them, one by one. Not with rage, with quiet arrival, with the weight of all I had carried. I pressed my hands against my lap, one on top of the other, calm, certain. I'm not back to take revenge, I thought. I'm back because I never left. There are silences that comfort. And there are silences that crack open the ground beneath you. The kind that doesn't just end a conversation, but a legacy. This was the second kind. The room still hadn't recovered from Harold's declaration, from the sound of my name, spoken with authority, recognized, acknowledged, final. Mason hadn't spoken again. His mouth moved occasionally, but no words came. Clarice shifted in her seat, arms crossed tighter than before, as if wrapping herself in denial. Emily blinked at the floor like she was doing math she had never bothered to learn. And me? I sat, still at the end of the table, still on the folding chair, still silent, but no longer unseen. Alden reached for the second envelope, the one I hadn't touched since I arrived. He unfolded a document with deliberate care, as if giving reverence to the next wave about to crash through that room. I am instructed, he said, to play an addendum to Mr. Hollander's recorded will. This portion was made in private counsel, 36 hours before his final hospitalization. He pressed play. Harold's voice was slower this time, clearer, more measured. It was a man no longer explaining, no longer justifying, only preparing. If you are listening, he said, you already know the truth about Judith. A pause. But there's more. Mason straightened a little, like he expected a correction, a loophole, some reversal. Instead, Harold continued, if any individual named in this trust, he said, has, by coercion, manipulation, or deceit, attempted to have Judith sign away her rights, or encouraged her to relinquish her legal identity under the Hollander holdings, the pause was longer this time, then that individual shall be immediately and irrevocably removed from this trust. Clarice gasped audibly. Mason turned toward her, not in anger, but with fear, the kind that comes not when you're caught, but when you realize you're on record. Alden raised his hand calmly. There's a supporting file, he said. He tapped on the keyboard. A video opened on the screen behind him. It was grainy. From a home security system, labeled simply Kitchen, January 3rd. The angle was slightly off-center, but the audio, crystal clear. Clarice's voice first. She'll sign it. Trust me. Old people sign things all the time. She doesn't even ask questions. Then Mason. If she hesitates, we'll tell her it's a bank form. Or something about funeral arrangements. She won't know. She hasn't touched a legal document in decades. Emily's mouth fell open. You recorded that, she whispered. Her voice didn't matter. It had already been said. Clarice stood up suddenly. This is illegal. This can't be admissible. But Alden turned calmly toward her. This was recorded by Mr. Hollander's own security system in his second residence, a property he solely owned and chose to monitor. The footage is date-stamped, untampered, and verified by both our firm and the notary present during his final amendment. Silence again. Wider. Heavier. like an eclipse had passed over the room and left nothing but wreckage. Clarice sat down slowly. Her legs looked unsure, her hands folded into fists. Mason didn't move. He didn't even blink. I could almost hear the gears in his head trying to reverse a train that had already derailed. Alden turned to me. Not directly, but enough that I could feel his respect. "There is also an attached clause," he said. "Judith has full discretion to preserve or remove the names listed in the trust. Any reinstatements must be filed through her, and her alone." My hand brushed against the envelope on my lap, the final document, the one that had traveled with me in silence. I didn't need to open it now. They all knew. What they didn't expect was my silence to hold more power than their noise. Clarice tried one last time. "Judith," she said, with the faintest attempt at softness, "you're not like this. You're not cruel? Number." But I was done being edited out of my own life. I looked at her. No anger, no tears, just clarity. I thought of the stickers she placed on my wedding photo, outdated. The locked pantry, the spa conversion plan, the way she pushed me into the laundry room, and Mason, how he told a room of people that I was legally nothing. Nothing. I had become the very center of the will they'd tried to erase me from. Harold had known, maybe too late, but enough to leave behind a voice that would outlive his body and expose theirs. My gaze scanned the room. Mason, Clarice, Emily, all of them frozen, held hostage not by me, but by the truth they never imagined would speak. "I'm not angry," I whispered in my thoughts. "I'm awake." And as the final clause settled into the air like dust after a building collapse, I stayed in my chair, still, rooted. My eyes met Alden's. He nodded once, and the record kept rolling. There are moments when silence holds the power of thunder. Moments when truth doesn't need to shout to be heard. It simply is, and its presence alters everything. Alden adjusted his glasses, slowly, almost reverently. His voice remained steady, but I could feel it, the tremor underneath. "Per the final revisions in Mr. Harold Hollander's estate," he said, "the entire remainder of the trust, valued at $142 million, and all corresponding intellectual property from the original IPO." He paused. Mason's breath hitched. Clarice's fingers gripped the edge of the polished table. "Shall transfer in full and sole ownership," Alden continued, "to Mrs. Judith Hollander, time fractured. There was no sound, no motion. Even the building seemed to inhale and hold. Then Mason exploded from his chair. "What? That's impossible. She doesn't know what a stock is." His voice cracked somewhere between panic and disbelief. He spun toward Alden. "This is a mistake. She's old. She didn't build any of this. My father, he built this empire." Clarice stood too. "This can't be legally binding. She didn't even work. She was just a housewife." "And I?" I lifted my gaze, softly, then finally spoke. Just one sentence, a whisper. "But the soup I made built this empire." Mason froze. Clarice's lips parted like she wanted to say something, wanted to laugh maybe, but it died in her throat. I could feel the words hanging in the air, not dramatic, not cruel, just true. The soup I made when Harold came home shaking. The soup I stirred while writing investor briefs between chopping onions. The soup I placed on Mason's tray as he studied in private school, paid by liquidation I orchestrated behind closed doors. The soup they now mocked had been the quiet fuel of everything they claimed as theirs. Alden unfolded a second page. "In addition," he said, "all previously named beneficiaries, excluding Mrs. Hollander, are now designated as discretionary. Their access to funds, properties, and privileges is subject to review under her authority." Mason turned red, then pale, then red again. He leaned forward, both fists clenched against the table. "You're doing this on purpose," he snarled at me. "You're trying to humiliate us. I didn't flinch. You did that yourselves, I thought. You humiliated yourselves the day you decided I was no longer useful. The day you said I was outdated, that I didn't matter. Alden continued, undisturbed. This trust includes rights to the estate's properties, business shares, and all residual holdings. Effective immediately, Mrs. Hollander has controlling authority over the family foundation, its board, and any future disbursements. Clarice let out a strangled noise, a hybrid of a laugh and a scream. She doesn't even know how to run a company. Emily, silent until now, finally whispered, "She was J. Carver." Mason whipped toward his daughter. "What did you say?" Emily didn't answer. Her eyes stayed on the table. On the place where the document sat bearing my name, Judith Hollander, legal beneficiary, intellectual architect, wife, mother, and now rightful heir. But I didn't feel victorious. Not in the way they imagined. This wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about teaching them a lesson. It was about reclaiming something I'd once laid down, out of love, out of hope, out of foolish faith that being invisible meant being safe. My thoughts returned to a memory, one they'd never seen. That winter night, Harold's trembling hands, the silence of our house before the IPO existed, the scent of my soup bubbling on the stove while I inked the final clause on a napkin, folded it beside his trembling fingers and whispered, "Use it. Say it's yours." I had vanished for them to rise. And now I'd returned, not to replace them, but to remember myself. I never wanted this to be a courtroom, I thought. I wanted a kitchen, a garden, a table where no one kept score. But the moment they turned my chair into exile, they left me no choice but to reclaim the map. Mason sat down hard, face in his hands. Clarice looked at me, not with rage, but fear. They didn't understand how it had all changed so quickly. But the truth is, it hadn't. I'd always been here. They'd simply refused to look. I reached into my handbag and placed a folded napkin on the table, a stained one. From that night, still faintly inked with the opening line of the IPO J. Carver, a hush fell again, not because I demanded silence, but because dignity, when it rises, needs no permission. 48 hours. That's what the lawyer gave them. 2 days to pack up, move out, disappear, the same way they had once asked me to. But I didn't wait at the window to watch them go. I didn't listen for slammed doors or broken glass. I waited until the last car had pulled out of the driveway, and then I stepped inside. My own home. It smelled different now. No perfume or cologne, no essential oils humming from spa diffusers. Only dust and a faint trace of rosemary from a candle I once lit when Harold had come home late and I wanted him to know I'd waited. The silence wasn't empty. It was sacred. The rooms were still cluttered, but not with furniture. They were filled with something colder. Stickers. Bright neon ones slapped onto drawers, mirrors, vases. This one's mine. I called dibs. Reserved. Dad promised me this. I stood in the middle of the hallway and just breathed. Each sticker felt like a bruise. Each claim, a small betrayal in print. The first one I peeled off was on a ceramic bowl, a bowl I had made in a pottery class when I was still Judith Adler, before I married Harold, before I gave up my last name. I held it in my hands and remembered how uneven it was. The lip curved wrong, but Harold had said it reminded him of the moon. The sticker said, Clarice's breakfast bowl. I peeled it off gently, placed the paper in a trash bag. Room by room I moved like that, a slow, deliberate undoing. On the piano bench, Emily's relaxation seat. Gone. On the clock from Harold's office, Caleb's pick. Gone. I found one on a framed photo of our wedding. It had been shoved behind a laundry basket, cracked frame, dust-lined. The sticker said simply, outdated. That one stung more than the rest. I held it between my fingers for a long time. Then slowly I peeled it. I pressed it against my palm and whispered, "You can't own what you don't understand." Into the trash bag it went. By the time I finished, the bag was full, bulging. Each sticker a receipt of entitlement, a neon badge of blindness. I carried the bag out to the garden. The sun was setting. Not dramatic. No orange fire. Just that soft, cool twilight where everything becomes translucent, like truth. I placed the bag in the old iron fire pit, lit a candle from the dining room, the same one they'd mocked me for hoarding. Its flame quivered, then steadied. One by one, I fed the stickers to the fire. They curled, hissed, blackened. Some sparked, some just sank into ash. I didn't cry, but I did feel something shift in my chest. A knot that had been tightening for years, finally letting go. I wasn't burning their memories. I was burning their assumptions. I was burning every label that tried to shrink me into something. Small, silent, and secondhand. They had written, "This one's mine," on objects. I had written, "This is who I am," in silence. And now, that silence was no longer erasure. It was ownership. The candle burned lower. I sat beside it, the warmth brushing my fingertips. No music, no applause, just the hush of a life reclaimed not with war, but with stillness. Behind me, in the kitchen, the soup pot gleamed. I hadn't used it in weeks, but tomorrow I would. Not for them, for me. The rosemary by the porch had withered. I hadn't noticed it until the morning after they left. It used to fill the air with sharp, clean scent. The smell of my early marriage, of Harold's favorite roast chicken, of Caleb's school lunches when he still called me Mom. Now it was brittle, each stem dry, like something that had waited too long for water that never came. I knelt beside it in the morning light, cut away the dead wood, and planted a new rosemary bush in its place. Something hardy. Something that could thrive even after being forgotten. The for sale sign went up quietly. No announcement, no family meeting. Just me, a phone call, and a signature that finally belonged to me. I bought a small apartment near the coast. Not grand, not gated, not marble floored. But it had light. So much light. And it had a window that faced the sea, where the wind moved like breath across the water. The first thing I did when I moved in was paint the walls myself, soft almond like the inside of a shell. I hung only 3 pictures, Harold and me at the IPO dinner, my rosemary bush in full bloom, and a photo of the soup pot. Not because I missed it, but because I remembered what it meant. The foundation papers arrived 2 weeks later. Women Who Remember. That's what I called it, a quiet fund for women like me. Who built things, signed nothing, and disappeared. Not for revenge, but for remembrance. I didn't want statues. I wanted scholarships. I wanted second chances in envelopes with real names on them. I wanted one woman, just one, to know that her quiet work had value, even if no one ever clapped. I carved a wooden plaque for the entryway. It took 3 days, a borrowed chisel, and more mistakes than I care to admit. But I smiled when I nailed it to the wall. This home was built by a woman once, unseen. But she never stopped thinking some mornings. I walk down to the beach with a book I never open. I sit with my coffee, the tide humming just beyond reach. I don't need to read. My life is enough of a story now. Sometimes people ask if I regret not speaking up sooner, if I wish I had fought harder, louder, earlier. The truth is, silence taught me how to listen, and listening taught me where to place my words, not to win, but to free. They ask if I still speak to my children. Sometimes, sometimes not. But I no longer wait for their permission to exist. One of the last things Harold ever said to me, before the illness clouded his voice, was this: "You always saw the storm coming. I only saw the sky. I didn't reply then. But if he were here now, I'd say, yes. But I also learned how to plant things in the rain. The rosemary has started to grow, slowly, quietly, without drama, just roots doing their work, just life beginning again. They thought I had died, but the truth? I was just waiting for the right moment to live again. Before we say goodbye, I want to ask you something. Where are you watching from? Is it a quiet morning, with coffee warming your hands? Or maybe it's midnight and stories like this one are your company in the dark. Tell us in the comments. We read every word with a full heart. And if this story meant something to you, even just a small ache or a flicker of hope, please consider subscribing to this channel, not just to hear more stories like mine, but to be part of something kinder, gentler, a community that still believes in second chances, in healing, and in the soft kind of strength the world so often forgets. Thank you for spending your time with me. It means more than you know. Wherever you are, whatever you're carrying, may you remember this. The miracle doesn't always knock. Sometimes it waits, softly, patiently, until you're ready to open your heart. Take care, and I'll see you in the next story.